Hello, and welcome to A Shadow of Divine Perfection, Art of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque. My name is Dr. Katie Clark, and on behalf of the patrons of the arts in the Vatican museums, thank you so much for joining us. Today's lecture on the Last Supper is the final lecture of this 7-part series, which has been underwritten and presented by the California and Northwest chapters of the Patrons of the Arts. As a nonprofit organization, the patrons work to preserve, protect, and restore the vast and unique treasures housed in the Vatican museums in Rome. For all of the patrons who have joined us from chapters around the world, thank you so much. Now, more than ever, the Vatican museums are grateful for your continued support, and you are invaluable in continuing the ongoing conservation work to protect the collections. And to all of our guests and new friends, it's been so good to have you with us on this series. It's been a pleasure to meet many of you by email and in questions every week. We really hope you've enjoyed this summer lecture series, and we hope it's given you a small taste of why being a patron is so rewarding. It's not just the restoration efforts we undertake, although, of course, those are absolutely critical. It's the sense of community, camaraderie, and a shared love of great art that binds together patrons, no matter our chapter, location, faith, or nationality. We hope you'll consider becoming a patron if you aren't a member already. It couldn't be simpler to join, and you're very welcome to reach out to me anytime if you have questions or want to know more. You can visit our website at californiapatrons.org, or you can send me an email anytime, and that email address is in all of the reminders and registration information that you've gotten for this series. And now, in honor of our last lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce a very special guest who is going to tell us a little bit more about why the patrons are so important. From the California chapter, please welcome chapter co-chairman James Lowe.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final lecture with Rocky in this series. My name is James Lowe, and I'm the co-chairman of the California Patrons. As patrons, we're passionate about art's ability to inspire, elevate, and reveal the human spirit. And our primary mission is to preserve, protect, and promote the artistic patrimony entrusted to the Vatican museums. It's important to all of us to participate in a meaningful way to safeguard humanity's history as told through our collections. It's a beautiful witness of faith, art, and culture that pontiffs of the past have brought to us. Patrons enjoy special cultural and artistic experiences throughout the year. Locally, we have docent-led tours at museums, we visit artists in their studios, and we go to many places that people can't get into on their own. In Rome, we have exclusive behind-the-scenes access and private tours of the Vatican museums, restoration labs, and special events. We have a thoughtful, welcoming community, and as we can see here with Rocky's talk today, we're including some unique lecture series to our portfolio of annual benefits. We promise the best of these digital efforts will be here to stay, even after the world starts to look a little bit more normal again. Our commitment to all patrons moving forward is that we will continue to maintain our position of leadership and provide a series of exclusive benefits to make being a patron even better in the years to come. We also make a firm commitment to provide great experiences across all touch points to make sure our interactions are exceptional, both when you visit the Vatican in person and when you're at home with your local chapter. We will continue to find fun ways to communicate with each other and meet our patrons, fellow donors, and our friends when and how each of us would like to be engaged, whether it's in person or online. As a dear friend of mine says, being a patron is enriching, it's fun, and it's impactful. Trifecta. Thank you all so much for being here, and a special thank you to you, Katie, and to you, Rocky, for being with us every Saturday for the last 2 months. We've enjoyed spending the summer with you and look forward to another great lecture coming up right now. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, James. We really appreciate that. Like James said, part of the fun of being a patron is access to some of the really amazing experiences and educational opportunities that you just can't get anywhere else. And certainly this lecture series is no exception. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce once more Dr. Rocky Ruggiero. I think by now Rocky probably needs no introduction to all of you who have been with us. But Rocky is a professor of art and architectural history. He is a lecturer for both American universities in Italy and a frequent guest on television documentaries about the Renaissance. After living in Florence for 20 years, Rocky now divides his time between the US and Italy, offering specialized lectures on art and architectural history. In Italy, Rocky leads private excursions and adult programs in Florence, Rome, Venice, Siena, and Northern Italy. And if you are sad to reach the end of this series, don't despair, because Rocky teaches online courses regularly, and you can find out all the details of his upcoming course offerings, as well as subscribe to his podcast, Rebuilding the Renaissance, on his website at rockyruggiero.com. So one more time, please, a warm patron's welcome to Rocky Ruggiero.
Buonasera, buonasera, or buongiorno to all of you, again, depending on where you are. A big grazie to James for his fantastic introduction and description about what the patrons are about. And I've been trying to emphasize, again, for the last couple of months, just how vital an organization it is. So again, please consider becoming a member because this idea of protecting, preserving the artwork is just tremendously important, obviously. And the fact that they actually did take the initiative to consider the educational component that we've been essentially experiencing together over the last 7 weeks is important as well, because of course it raises awareness as to just how important these masterpieces are. A big thank you to Katie for holding my hand through this whole experience as well. She, of course, is the sort of mastermind behind the scenes. I'm just the guy who gets to babble for 45 minutes about this beautiful artwork. All right, without further ado, let us get into what is one of the most famous and well-known paintings on planet Earth, and that, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. Right, now, growing up as an Italian American, I was under the impression that just about every household that I ever stepped foot in actually had a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper inside. I just see the painting over and over again in these various homes of aunts, uncles, cousins, etc., etc. But now that I look back and consider, now that I know what I know about Renaissance art history, what I've begun to realize is that I wasn't actually looking at Leonardo's Last Supper. What I was looking at was copies of Leonardo's Last Supper. In other words, the copies that they had in their homes were copies of the copy, because Leonardo's painting is in such bad shape that no one really likes to look at it. And so what we do is we sort of replace it with famous and well-known copies like the one you see here by Gian Pietrino. In fact, I remember distinctly as an undergraduate student when we were studying the Last Supper and hearing my professor talk about how Judas was actually knocking over the salt cellar, which of course in Italian culture and tradition is considered to be bad luck. And I would scour the painting looking for exactly this particular detail, but never found it, because what I realized is that you can see it clearly here. Here's Judas holding his money bag, his 30 pieces of silver. And if you look directly under his right hand, you can see the upturned salt cellar. But you cannot see it here in Leonardo's actual painting, because it's so deteriorated that there is no longer a salt cellar there. So oftentimes what we're talking about is essentially a leap of faith, because we are presuming that these copies are in fact faithful copies of Leonardo's Last Supper. And so they kind of bring it all together and show us what the architectural setting may have looked like. These rather gaudy tapestries that you see there, these window shutters on the side, the landscape through the window, the pediment that we're going to talk about a little bit later, barely visible here. Or how about Jesus's feet, right, which of course are not visible in the original painting because this doorway was actually knocked through in the 17th century, kind of shortcut to the kitchen that was located just behind. And in fact, it is very important to talk about the state of conservation of this work. One of the most famous paintings in the history of art, which unfortunately was executed in a rather experimental style. Right? This is a mural, M-U-R-A-L, and mural, of course, from the Italian muro, M-U-R-O, which means wall. So a mural is a painting on the wall, but that doesn't necessarily connotate a fresco painting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about media here. The Italian name for a fresco painting is affresco. There's the letter A, which is actually the preposition, meaning to, T-O in English. So an affresco is a medium where you are applying pigment to fresco, to fresh plaster. It is pigment suspended in water. So essentially you're using watercolors that are then painted onto wet plaster. There's a chemical reaction that takes place between the pigments and the plaster itself. It's called carbonization. And what happens is that they become one and the same. So a true fresco painting technically means that the pigment is not on the wall. It means that the pigment is in the wall. And technically, if you were to rub your hand over the surface of a true fresco, or what the Italians call buon fresco, good fresco, then you shouldn't have any residue. For the love of God, please don't ever rub your hand over a fresco painting, but technically that's what should have, nothing there, because the pigments are actually embedded and have become part of the plaster. Well, I think most of you know that when you're working in fresco, you don't have to be fast, but you can't be slow, right? You're sort of working against, of course, the clock in the time that it takes for the plaster to dry. Now, consider that the artist that we're discussing today, Leonardo da Vinci, was anything but hasty in his methodology. In fact, he was known as the artist who never knew when to take his hand off of the canvas. In other words, for Leonardo, it was never finished. Now, I think I know why Leonardo never wanted to stop working, because for him, the moment he stopped painting, the work of art ceased to live. It became inanimate. But the more he kept painting, he kind of kept it alive because it was morphing and it was changing or what have you. So when he was hired to paint a massive mural, this painting is about 15 feet tall by about 30 feet wide. So this is not small. And if you've never seen The Last Supper in person, you're actually standing underneath it looking up. I'll show you a photo of the setting just a little bit later. Leonardo decided to attempt a sort of experimental technique where he laid out the entire area of plaster that he was going to paint. He let it dry, and then he suspended his pigments in binders, technically, right? Which are technically called tempera. And in Italy, what tempera usually means is egg. Okay, egg is a sticky substance. You put your pigments in it, you paint onto the dry plaster. Well, Leonardo decided to mix the tempera with oil, which at the time was still a relatively new medium and was not a great idea, because what happened was that within just a couple of years of completing the painting, it gradually began to run off of the wall. Okay, sort of fall off. In fact, consider that when, there he is, this wouldn't be my last class without me picking up my Giorgio Vasari, my faithful copy that's here always by my side. When Vasari saw Leonardo's Last Supper, a couple of decades, maybe 3 decades after Leonardo painted it, Vasari's description of the Last Supper was a spot on the wall. So if 30 years after Leonardo painted it, Vasari's calling it a spot on the wall, then what is it that we are looking at today? Well, what you're looking at is an incredibly heavily restored painting. In fact, the last major restoration campaign that took place over 21 years, 1978 to 1999, when a woman named Brambilla actually put it together. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the restoration because people said, look, there's no Leonardo left. It's been so heavily restored that what you're looking at is actually more the work of the restorer than the work of the artist. But to be perfectly honest, everyone, I mean, this painting needed to be put on life support. And what Brambilla was able to do was nearly magical in pulling enough of it together to give us a pretty strong sense of what this painting looked like when Leonardo actually left it some 500 years ago. All right. Okay, let's leave now the state of conservation. Let us turn instead to the subject matter. All right. This painting is almost always referred to as the Last Supper, when in reality, we shouldn't be using the determinate article. It should be called a Last Supper, because this is just one of many representations of the subject. It just happens to be the most famous. So it becomes the definitive article, as opposed to the indefinite instead. Because the earliest known Last Supper painting is actually 1,000 years older than this one, and it is located in the great city of Ravenna. Now, I think some of you were actually part of that full-day Saturday Smithsonian marathon that I did a few weeks back. I actually gave a lecture on the mosaics in Ravenna for the Smithsonian about a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about how it is surprising to discover that the earliest known cyclical representation of the story of Jesus Christ is actually in this church, right? One imagines, of course, that we've always been depicting the story of Jesus since the inception of Christianity. But in reality, we have to wait about 500 years from the time of Christ's birth to actually see that story told. And it is told here in the nave of this early Christian Basilica of Santa Apollinare Nuovo that we find it. And you actually have to look hard to find the story of Jesus Christ. Okay, we're looking through the columns here. And if you look, it's hard to get a good photo of this, but directly above the windows, can you make out the mosaics way at the top of the wall, at the very top of the clear story level? That section is essentially the earliest known representation of the story of Jesus Christ. And if it is the story of Jesus Christ, then of course it is going to include a Last Supper. So technically speaking, this is the earliest known Last Supper, right? Created in the 500s after Christ, and not surprisingly looking very much like a sort of Hellenistic dinner versus a Judaic one. In other words, Jesus in his purple toga, reclining, as the Greeks and Romans did when they dined, with the apostle. There's Peter with his typical white hair and beard. All the apostles have really scrunched in there, really tightly composed inside. And look at the dirty looks flying over in this direction, because of course the character directly across from Jesus, slightly smaller than everyone else in the scale, is the bad guy. That is Judas sitting over there on the other side. So it's interesting to see how the earliest Last Supper doesn't look anything at all like the one that you see behind me, but instead much more like what contemporary eating habits would have been in the 6th century, including the menu. Because what you see on the table is not lamb, which becomes the more typical dish that is served at Last Suppers in the Middle Ages, but instead are 2 large spigole, or sea bass, which of course makes perfect sense because we are in Ravenna, which is right there on the Adriatic coast. And so seafood would have been the more common menu served at the time. And so interesting to see how different places, different times represent this specific subject. Right? In fact, for our next major Last Supper, we visit the extraordinarily beautiful medieval town of Siena with its extraordinary Gothic style cathedral. And once upon a time, there was a massive altarpiece known as the Maestà, which is the Italian word for majesty, which sat on the high altar of Siena Cathedral. It was painted by Siena's sort of patriarch of painting. His name was Duccio. He was the founder of the 14th century Sienese school of painting, which in many ways was at least equal to, if not superior, what was happening in Florence at the time with Cimabue, Giotto, and company. And many of you may have seen this painting inside of the Cathedral Museum. It's a rather somber setting. You walk into this dark room. They're very concerned, of course, about conservation. There's this high-tech climate control. There's this dramatic lighting. In fact, it almost feels like you're at a wake. You almost feel like you're paying your respects. And unknowingly, you actually are, because this is what the painting looks like today. But this painting was actually the central panel of a much larger altarpiece, Madonna in Majesty. Maestà means majesty. So this is not your run-of-the-mill Madonna and Child. This is a much more complex, much more majestic interpretation of the subject. We don't know exactly what this painting looked like. This is a hypothetical reconstruction, but we do know its exact original dimensions, which were about 16 feet tall by just under 16 feet wide. This was gigantic and sitting on the high altar of Siena Cathedral. And this is what some people think the front of the painting looked like, and this is what they think the back of the painting looked like. So both front and back were decorated. The back depicts, of course, scenes from the life here of Jesus Christ, 26 of them, painted by Duccio in the early 14th century. Now, why is the painting no longer in its original frame? Well, because in the 18th century, when this particular style of painting fell out of favor, the powers that be in Siena decided to sell the painting off, but there aren't too many people who have living rooms large enough to accommodate 16 by 16 foot paintings, so they chopped it up and dismembered it. And here in the United States, when things get back to normal, you can find pieces of the Maestà in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, and in the Frick collection as well in New York. So there are pieces of this painting in the U.S. But let's look a little more carefully here at the back side of the Maestà. 26 scenes depicting the life of Jesus Christ with a real non-linear organization. Right? We start down here in the lower left-hand corner, and then we go up here, and then we go down here, and then we go up here, right? And probably because the backside, I'll leave this for another lecture one day, but the backside was probably only seen by clergy, by priests, who would have appreciated the kind of challenge, if you will, in trying to figure out exactly how the story unraveled itself. In fact, proof that this was, in all likelihood, a audience-specific painting. In other words, one where the artist was very much conscious of who it was who was going to see it, is the Last Supper that Duccio painted. Okay, so here we have Jesus with 12, soon to be 11 of his best friends, the so-called apostles, sharing their last meal together, much like you and I are sharing our last webinar together today. And when you see a Last Supper, again, the two most important characters are, of course, Jesus and Judas, the protagonist in Jesus, the antagonist in Judas. And spotting Jesus is usually fairly simple because Jesus usually looks Jesus-y. And yes, I actually accept that as an answer from my students. What I mean by saying he looks Jesus-y is Jesus iconography. There is a set way in which Jesus is usually represented in European art. It's the mix between that hippie and kind of Ivy League college professor with the long hair and the goatee and the beard and what have you as well. And of course, the halo helps. And you can spot Jesus, quite easily in this Last Supper. But then the question is, where is Judas, right, the antagonist in the scene? Now, there are a series of set criteria that we can use in identifying the figure of Judas, who, if you don't know, was, of course, the apostle who betrayed Jesus Christ, who actually indicted Christ with the accusation that he was the guy claiming to be the Messiah or the King of the Jews. All three of those criteria for identifying Judas appear in the Last Supper that you see down here, okay, which is painted on the wall of the Refectory of Santa Croce. It's the major Franciscan convent in Florence. The Church of Santa Croce is the largest Franciscan church in the world. So two important points that we just passed by without me stopping and pointing out, so I need to now. The only place you see Last Suppers depicted are either in the context of Christologies, that is the story of Jesus, because the Last Supper is the event that happens on Holy Thursday night, or we see Last Suppers in refectories or dining halls, because the message of a Last Supper is not about the Eucharist. It's nothing heavy duty in terms of theology. It's very simply Jesus eating with his friends, and so too the clergy in the dining hall or the refectory eating as well. So the sort of communion of experiences versus the actual communion as the institution of the Eucharist. And if we look down below, here's a close-up, to Taddeo Gaddi's Last Supper. He establishes for us very clearly the three criteria with which we can identify Judas. The first and most obvious is the isolation theory, as I like to call it. Judas is usually the only apostle sitting on the other side of the table by himself. So that's a pretty effective way to identify him. Okay, the second way you can identify Judas is the halo theory, because he's usually the only one depicted without one, because as you can probably well imagine, Judas ain't no saint. The third way by which you can identify Judas is what I call the food and beverage theory. Okay, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John all identify Judas using food. They say that either he took bread before Jesus had a chance to bless it, as it's described in the Gospel of John, or that Judas dipped bread into a bowl of wine at the same time as Jesus Christ. Okay? Isolation theory, halo theory, food and beverage. All three are happening here. He's by himself, he doesn't have a halo, and his left hand is extending to dip bread into a bowl of wine. All right? Now, with that criteria, let's go back to Duccio. And I ask, which one of the figures is Judas? Right, now, I love doing this when I'm in Siena and I'm in the Cathedral Museum and I have my students in front of the painting. The only hint that I give them when we're trying to figure it out is to not lose sight of the forest through the tree. And of course, they look at me and ask me, what the hell does that mean? You know it's got to be one of these five guys because they're all five halo-less, right? So you have a 1 in 5 chance. You have a 20% chance of getting it right without knowing the answer. But if we do apply the criteria that I just mentioned, we can't use the isolation theory because there are 5 guys here. Why are there 5 guys in front of the table? Well, because they all can't fit on the other side. It's that simple an issue. All 5 of them do not have halos. And why do all 5 not have halos? Well, because in a pre-perspective world, the 2-dimensional halos would have obstructed the entirety of the table. You wouldn't even recognize this as the Last Supper. The food and beverage theory falls apart because the smartest apostle is the guy over here with a glass of wine in his hand. Then you got this guy putting a piece of bread in his mouth, and this guy has a piece of bread as well. So all 3 of those criteria fall through, if you will. Which one of these guys is Judas? Well, what I'm implying by saying don't lose sight of the forest through the tree is that inevitably you will sit here and stare at this scene so intensely, hoping that something in it will in fact reveal the identity of Judas. But the only way to figure out which one is Judas is to continue reading. You have to keep watching the movie, if you get my drift. We're down here with the Last Supper. Now we go up here and we look at the next scene in sequence, which is the Pact of Judas. You see Judas here with his green tunic, his orange toga, short brown hair, short pointy beard, taking his 30 pieces of silver. Now that we know what Judas looks like, we reverse engineer this. We go back to the Last Supper. Which one's Judas? And for those of you playing at home, Judas is right there. Right? Now, the reason I do this is not to make my students feel dumb. It's to illustrate a point. I told you that this was an audience-specific painting. They're third-year, college-educated, first-world citizens, and they can't figure out which one is Judas. How much more chance did a poor illiterate mob in the 14th century? Which is why I'm convinced that Duccio knew that the only people who'd see the backside of this painting would in fact have been clergy, who would have appreciated this sort of Where's Waldo game that he's actually playing with him at the time. All right, let's look now at another Last Supper. Last Suppers that Leonardo would have been familiar with. I want to be clear about this. This is not just a survey of Last. These are Last Suppers that Leonardo would have been familiar with and would have eventually influenced his own composition. We are here in the mother of all chapels, okay, the Scrovegni, my favorite absolute work of art on planet Earth. And here you can actually see it right down there on the right-hand side. The G-man, as I like to call him, Giotto, paints his Last Supper. All right? Now, I used to pass by this in my telling of the story in the Scrovegni chapel. And so here's Giotto's Last Supper. Where's Judas? Well, here he is. Okay, and another way we can actually identify Judas is that he's usually shown wearing yellow. When you're trying to read medieval art, painting in particular, the bad guys usually wear yellow. And in a 14th century openly anti-Semitic society, Jews were usually dressed in the color yellow as well. So colors do often have meaning, and yellow is the color of Judas most of the time. And you see him dipping actively his hand into the bowl of wine, as Jesus does as well. You notice that he does have the silhouette of a halo. The reason is because later on, you see Jesus's halo is the only one that still survives. This is not a miracle. This is because the gold was reapplied. And in fact, the halos were completely reconstructed in later centuries. It was in the 18th century. And someone didn't do his Judas homework, because if they had, then of course they would have known that he should not have had a halo applied. They just probably didn't realize that that was Judas at the time. Anyway, I pass over the scene saying it's, you know, an okay representation. And then one of my students rightly pointed out that what makes this Last Supper so extraordinary is that no one in the painting is looking at the camera. Right? For 14th century art, most of the time the figures are perfectly frontal and stare straight out at you in a kind of hieroglyphic fashion. Instead, here you actually see them going about their business. And much like Leonardo, and I'm going to say this to you in about 10 minutes, that what makes Leonardo so extraordinary is that his paintings look less like something he created and more like something he captured, like a photographer might. And that is the same description that I use when I talk about Giotto, who's painting some 200 years before Leonardo da Vinci. Or one Last Supper that actually did directly influence Leonardo's work is located in the refectory of a nunnery in Florence called Sant'Apollonia. It's right down the street from San Marco, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you're in Florence anytime soon, everyone, make sure you go. It's free. You don't have to pay anything to go in. There's no one ever in here. It's just you and this massive fresco of the Last Supper. And it's an amazing, intimate experience that you have with the work of art that is incredibly well preserved, because there's actually a building on the other side of the wall, which is not the case with Leonardo's behind me. This was actually an exposed wall on the other side, and it's a northern facing wall. So of course there wasn't enough light to dry it out, so the humidity actually compromised it. Here instead, it's perfectly preserved. An artist you may or may not have heard of named Andrea Del Castano. He's a sort of second generation early Renaissance artist, an artist who's still experimenting with perspective, and you can actually see it here because it's kind of odd. If I'm not going to do this, but if we were to count up the tiles in the ceiling, there are 33 of them going across, and there are 17 going in. So the room is rectangular. If we were to count up the little oval shapes here, there are 33 and a third going across. There are 17 going in. So the room is rectangular. But if we count up the panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and suddenly the room has become square. What's going on here? Well, it's an artist who's not necessarily going to the trouble of perfecting his linear perspective. In fact, if you look carefully, look at these parallel lines, which diverge as opposed to converging, right? Because it's that second generation where essentially, hell, it looks three-dimensional. Who cares? Who's going to sit there with a ruler and actually try to figure out the vanishing point or the point of convergence and everything else? What this artist cares about instead is the action that's taking place. And all the Last Suppers that I've shown you so far are Last Suppers where there are multiple activities, multiple actions going on. It's not one thing, it's many things as well. And so this kind of looks like a pretty boring work dinner. Okay, and that's what I love about this, the universality of a 600-year-old painting that reminds me very much of many dinners that I've actually been to myself. Let's start over here with St. James the Minor, right? The younger of the two apostles named St. James, who's, he's one of these guys who just never stopped talking about work. And you can see he's sitting next to the right guy because they're both intently discussing something, right? Whereas next to him, I love this. This is Doubting Thomas. And Thomas is like, all right, so I'm going to play golf on Saturday morning, and I'll probably mow the lawn when I get back. You see, he's completely elsewhere, consumed in his thoughts. In reality, what Thomas is doing, Doubting Thomas, as we know him, is thinking, and what you don't see in the photograph I'm showing you, because the upper portion of the wall is so deteriorated, is that up above this Last Supper is, in fact, the crucifixion, the entombment, and the resurrection. So in a way, the paintings up above are kind of the thought bubble coming out of Thomas's head. But I just find it more humorous to think that he's the guy who just can't wait for this party to be over with. Here's St. James the Great. Now, interesting here, he's holding up the glass at neck level. And if you don't know, James the Great was martyred by being decapitated. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of his eventual martyrdom. Said I see it as James thinking like, oh God, I think I'm drank too much, as he stares kind of groggily into that glass that he's holding. All right, here's the main event. All right, here's Peter looking over at Jesus. And interesting too, that Peter's right arm comes down, but that is a left hand that's attached to it, which may or may not be an intentional sort of trick. There's Jesus just saying, I knew I shouldn't have brought John. I knew I should have brought him, because John, the sublime apostle, John, the beloved apostle, I call him John, the lush apostle, because he drank too much at the Last Supper. Boom, he passes out. And Jesus saying, I knew he was going to do it. And then, of course, we have Judas, who's sitting on the other side of the table by himself, who doesn't have a halo. And whoa, look, he's got a sop of bread in his hand. And the curious thing about this is, look at the distinct shape of the champagne flute that actually forms in the folds of Jesus's robe. Intentional? Don't know, but there it is. It sort of looks like this big chalice that he's actually holding as well. And by the way, this particular rendition, look at the ears of Judas. Look at the pointy beard. Look at the hooked nose. We're following the Gospel of John, which says that the moment Judas decides to betray Christ, the devil took hold of him. So we're seeing this physical metamorphosis that's actually taking place in the scene. But let's keep going across. This is one of my favorite images. Here's St. Andrew. I think I showed this to you in the Saint Symbols and Spaghetti lecture, who's holding this really big knife. And next to him is poor St. Bartholomew, who you may remember was martyred by being skinned alive. And so he looks rather worried as he looks over at Andrew, because Bartholomew suffers from the clinical condition known as echinophobia, which is fear of knives and sharp objects. Right? So this is a pretty entertaining dinner we're at least in the eyes of most, because you have poor Simon here who just can't wait for this thing to be over. And I know that feeling. I can empathize with him well because he happens to be sitting next to the most vocal of all the apostles. There's Matthew who's just yelling across the table, and Simon just thinking, get me out of this place. Multiple things going on. And the reason there are multiple things, everyone, is because of the entertainment value. Okay, this is not 21st century, wherever you're sitting right now, where you can just change the channel. You're bored with what you're watching, change the channel. Every single day, the nuns would be sitting in this room looking up at Castano's Last Supper and picking up on these little nuances, perhaps becoming as neurotically familiar with the painting as I have, and start to attribute characteristics. Oh, look, poor Simon there looks like a crabby guy. Oh, look, poor Bartholomew's afraid of heights. The artist is putting this stuff in so that you don't notice it all at once, but gradually over time, as you become more familiar with the work, you sort of make it your own. And in fact, it is one of the fundamental differences between all the other Last Suppers that lead up to Leonardo's and Leonardo's himself. Okay, and here it is. So this is the apotheosis of the subject of the Last Supper. Right? And before I get ahead of myself, you see that it's located in Santa Maria delle Grazie. And if you don't know what that means, Santa Maria delle Grazie is a church in the city of Milan. It is the major Dominican church in that city. And the crossing area, the tribune technically, of Santa Maria delle Grazie was meant to be the mausoleum of the Duke of Milan in the late 15th century, whose name was Ludovico Sforza. He was known as the Moor because of his dark complexion. And this whole area was built up by the great architect Bramante. Yes, your very own Bramante, architect of St. Peter's, was first employed by Ludovico Sforza to build his mausoleum here at Santa Maria delle Grazie. And in the adjoining convent where the Dominican friars live, we find Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper in the refectory. So in the dining hall of the Dominican friars. And so this is what it looks like, little pulled back, right? You see how it's actually painted, a horizontal rectangular shape on the end, on the northern end wall, technically, of the space. And the amazing thing about this, though, is that as deteriorated as it is, whenever I'm in this room, and if you've not been there, well, A, it's nearly impossible to get a reservation. So when I book for my Boston College group, we usually go in January, February. I usually reserve in November of the previous year. And consider it's low season, and I still have difficulty getting reservations for it. The reason is there's a very limited number of people that they allow in every 15 or 20 minutes, and they sell the reservations up, not to mention that it is just typical Italian inefficient bureaucracy, where they're just, I don't want to get into this right now, but lots of tour operators that buy up the tickets beforehand, and so it makes it impossible for anyone else to get them. But what happens is you show up, you go into a hallway. You're actually technically in a cloister of the convent, but they've sealed the whole thing up with glass. And once they have all the people going in at a certain time slot in, they shut these hermetically sealed doors behind you. And once they shut another set of doors open, you move into a next chamber, the door is shut, another set open, and then you're inside of the actual refectory. And you see the Last Supper over there on the right-hand side. You get about 15, 20 minutes or so inside the room. Again, your head reaches up to about here. You can't get that close. They keep you a little bit further away, but just to give you a sense of size. Again, the thing is 15 feet tall, so it's quite large. And then when you leave, I always stop everyone and say, hey, everyone, turn around, just take a glance at the Last Supper, because when you look at it quickly as you're walking out, the perspective is so spot on this thing that it clearly gives you the impression that there is no wall here, that this is just continuous space, that the wall is actually the wall that Leonardo paints in the scene. And that's what he's trying to do. You follow? The idea essentially of just extending the architecture of the room illusionistically in the architecture of the Last Supper, which is the most perfect expression of linear or single point perspective in the history of art. It's done so extraordinarily well. In fact, one of the amazing things, the vanishing point, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if we were to draw lines along the edges of these rectangular tapestries running down, which may or may not have been as gaudy as the one in the reproduction I showed you before, those lines would meet here. You can actually even see the nails that fix the tapestries to the walls. You see them up here? The vanishing point is just to your left of the head of Jesus Christ. So wherever that vanishing point is where our eyes are. So even though you're standing in the room looking up at the Last Supper, it is as if we're standing on the same pavement as Jesus and the apostles. You're looking up at it, but you're seeing it more or less at eye level. That's why I'm looking up at it, but I can see the pavement upon which they're sitting down. You follow? That vanishing point that gets lost in this atmospheric perspective through the window behind Jesus, who, like all the apostles, is haloless. And why is Jesus and why are the apostles haloless? Because I think Leonardo realized how foolish these halos made everything look. I mean, this is a scientist who's extraordinarily talented as an artist. And have any of you ever seen anyone walking around with metal discs above their heads? Right? I mean, that's, you know, it became such a common motif, but I think it would, for Leonardo, and it would just render the entire thing absurd. So what he does instead, I know you can barely make it out, but think back to the reproduction I showed you before. There is a rounded or segmented pediment, that's what we call them technically, which if we were to continue into a full circle, right, would essentially encircle Jesus's head, and that natural light that comes from behind Christ would, of course, give this sense of a halo. So it's a much more subtle way to actually represent it than actually slapping a metal plate on top of Jesus's head. Jesus and all 12 of the apostles on one side of the table, and this is a novelty. Every Last Supper I've showed you thus far, except for the one 1,000 years before, had Jesus and Judas on opposite sides of the table. So here's Jesus, and here is Judas, as I mentioned earlier on. Moneybag, the invisible salt cellar that's tipped over, and look, he's extending his left hand, his sinistra, which comes from the Latin word sinistra, or sinister, evil hand, towards the piece of bread with which he, and you see Jesus extending simultaneously, are going to dip their bread, right? So we identify Judas. Now consider that when Leonardo was first thinking about this composition, he did originally plan on following convention. This is a drawing that's in the Accademia Gallery in Venice, a preparatory study of Leonardo's Last Supper by Leonardo. This is his drawing. And you can tell it's Leonardo because look how the cross-hatching goes from upper left to lower right. Leonardo was a southpaw. He was a lefty. So his cross-hatching goes this way. A right-handed artist like Michelangelo's goes upper right to lower left instead. There's Jesus, there's John, there's Peter. Right? And then it's interesting too because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? The reason these 4 guys are down here is because the piece of paper wasn't large enough to actually accommodate them. So what he's done is just sort of extended, you know, essentially, look at this hand right here is the same hand that you see up there. So this guy is this guy. So this is the lower portion. I keep touching my screen. I know you can't see me do this, but the lower portion is the continuation of the upper portion of the butt. So originally Leonardo was planning on putting Judas on the other side of the table, but then for whatever reason, changed his mind. And I think the whatever reason was, well, that would look kind of silly as well, because when was the last time you were at a dinner party with 12 people sitting on one side and one poor guy sitting by himself? The painting would lose all sense of spontaneity and realism. So what he does is to put them all on the same side. He's made Judas lower than everyone else. You see that? Slightly smaller than everyone else. So this is kind of a convention that he may have gotten from that mosaic in Ravenna. He's got the pointy beard. He's got the hook nose. He got that from Castano. But perhaps most importantly, he's reduced his version of the Last Supper to a single moment of the story. And it is that moment where Jesus Christ drops the proverbial bomb on all of the apostles by announcing in the middle of the dinner, this night, one of you will betray me. Right? And you can see the shockwaves that are sent out in the middle of this dinner party. I don't know if you've ever been at one that's this dramatic or what have you, a family Thanksgiving dinner where someone announces something that's just cataclysmic. And you know, let's go left to right, because the way he's organized it, essentially you have 4 distinct groups of 3. Right? But every group of 3 is then intertwined or woven into the emotion and the reaction of the other. So we start with Bartholomew all the way down here on the left-hand side. And you know this. You see this on TV all the time. Bartholomew jumps up, and as he does, you imagine the stool sliding up, kicking out from behind him. It's a kind of cliche thing. Here's James the Minor reaching over in this direction. So it's his hand that connects this group to this group. Here is Andrew, who brings his hands up like this in surprise. Then we have that sort of main group of Judas we've already discussed. Remember, Peter who was the most insecure of the apostles, leaning over, knows John is real tight with Jesus. So, hey, listen, ask him if it's going to be me who's going to betray him, right? As he whispers into John's ear, the right hand of Peter with that knife pointing back, with which he would then later cut off the ear of the servant of the Sanhedrin. The figure of John the Beloved. And for any of you Dan Brown disciples, no, that is not Mary Magdalene. Sorry to disappoint you, everyone, but John the Beloved apostle was the youngest of the apostles. And in Renaissance art, convention was to make men look young. They were made to look effeminate. The reason it looks like a woman is because it's John the Beloved apostle. And believe it or not, John, in every Last Supper I've shown you thus far, has looked effeminate. So Leonardo was just following convention. He wasn't in on any kind of conspiracy theory regarding Jesus's affair or what have you. Jesus isolated in the center, this triangular composition, right hand palm down, left hand palm up. And I love this game that he's playing because it's all a series of just geometric shapes. The circle behind him, the rectangle, the triangle that's sort of running through the middle of it. And then here we have James the Great. And I love that, whoa, as he pushes back and the two other apostles come over his arms. You may remember this guy. This is Thomas. I showed you him in the Saints and Symbols lecture with that probing finger that he would use to prove that Christ was back from the dead. Here is Saint Philip. And this is just such an Italian thing. I mean, I do this 1,000 times a day. When my wife accuses me of not flushing the toilet or something, me, right? Sort of giving that sort of expression. And then that group of three tied into this group by this figure in his contrapposto. The right arm extending in this direction, his head. This is St. Matthew, saying, hey, did you hear what that said? And this guy reiterated, hey, did you hear what they said? And then finally all the way down to Simon here, Simon the Zealot, whose hands then turn us back in the opposite direction. Now think about how difficult it is and that's what Leonardo did that's so exceptional. All the other ones were different moments in time in one Last Supper. This is a single moment in time instead, and to weave it all in coherently. Again, to make it seem like Leonardo didn't depict this. Leonardo was the photographer lying on the floor when dinner was happening. And like all great photographers, his spider sense started tingling just at the right moment, knew something was about to happen, had the camera at the ready, popped up, and bam, captures it for the cover of Life magazine. I mean, it really is the cover of Life magazine type of icon type image that we're looking at here with Leonardo. It's extraordinary. It is a tragedy that it's in such good shape. But again, it is nearly miraculous that there is any of it left for us to enjoy. If you've not seen The Last Supper yet, make sure you put it on the very, very top of your bucket list because it's an emotional experience to actually be in the presence of a work that Leonardo worked on, consistently for about a 3-year period. It's almost a relic to those of us in the history of art. Lastly, the art of throwing a great dinner party. The Last Supper legacy continues beyond. This is not the definitive and final Last Supper. There are many more. I actually just talked about this in a webinar that I gave yesterday. Is Paolo Veronese's gigantic. This thing is 19 feet tall. It's 43 feet long, oil on canvas, so therefore mobile, painting that began as a Last Supper. Now, this is Venetian painting, and maybe one day, if we pick up these lectures, we'll talk more about Venetian art, because it really is one of my favorite subjects. And the thing about Venice is that Venetian artists love to celebrate Venice. Venice was the wealthiest, most powerful city pretty much in most of medieval and Renaissance Europe. And it also developed this reputation for debauchery and hedonism. Consider it was a city where there was about one female prostitute for every 10 people. I call Venice the Las Vegas of the Renaissance. So even a Last Supper takes on that kind of festive atmosphere that one would find. Think of Carnevale and what evolves out of Venice later on. And this beautiful loggia, you have to work hard. I mean, you see Jesus, you see Peter, there's John looking effeminate again. But you have to look hard for the other apostles who are kind of scattered through. Interesting, there's one of them picking his teeth. It looks anything like what we imagine a solemn Last Supper to look like. In fact, right down here, here's a detail. You can almost imagine the jester who was just on coffee break, smoking a cigarette a minute before, and then the little waiter comes over and says, it's over, break's over, and it's kind of startled. Here's the maitre d' hustling and bustling, make sure everything goes correctly. There's that little fork that I mentioned before. Look at the soldiers. After everyone else is eaten, of course, the staff needs to eat. And it's just such a mundane, by which I mean worldly type of image, that word got out that Paolo Veronese was painting an indecorous Last Supper. In other words, it was completely inappropriate. It was totally lacking in the solemnity that we associate with the subject. And so a summons appeared, sent by the Holy Office of the Inquisition. That's what you're looking at right here. It says that the Tribunalis, the Sacro Tribunal, so the sacred tribune, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, kindly request Paulus Cagliarus Veronensis. His real name, Paolo Veronese, was Paolo Cagliari. He came from Verona to present him, who lives, in the parish of Saint Samuel, to please present himself so that he can defend himself of accusations of blasphemy for showing this debaucherous Last Supper painting. Well, what did Veronese do? Well, he was sort of tipped off to what was going to happen. So in his central group of Jesus, Peter, John, and there's Judas, right? And I love the Judas image. He's on the other side. Granted, none of the other apostles have halos, so he doesn't have one either. The shadow clearly indicates that he's up to no good. But I love the way he turns away. This is, that awkward moment where Jesus probably just, hey, John, one of you guys is going to betray me. And Judas does the old kind of turn away, kind of coughing thing, almost as if he didn't hear Jesus pronounce it. But important thing is that this figure was not originally in the painting. This is the figure that Paolo Veronese photoshopped into the painting to save his own hide. Because when they asked him, so why have you made the Last Supper look like this raging party? Veronese said, oh, there's been a misunderstanding. You think that this is a Last Supper. But in reality, this figure that Veronese added in later is supposed to represent Simon Levy, the Pharisee in whose home Jesus dined, and the Pharisees were thought to be these great hypocrites or what have you. And so Veronese said, you think it's a Last Supper, but in reality, I'm painting one hell of a party in the house of Simon Levy. And with that, people said, oh, okay, so there has been a misunderstanding. You're fine to go. You're free to go as well. He defended himself by simply transforming what is clearly a Last Supper into this party in the house of the Pharisee. And those Pharisees were probably very lascivious people, so it was okay for him to paint it such. So notwithstanding the Last Suppers, though, that come after Leonardo's, of course, it is Leonardo's that remains the most iconic version, like Michelangelo's David, like Michelangelo's Pietà. There are those works of art that have become so extraordinarily famous that they almost supersede the very subject that they define. All right. So with that, I'm going to cease and desist for the last time. Sad to see all of this series come to an end, but again, I'd like to thank all of you, Katie, James, everyone involved, because it's been really great fun spending my Saturdays with you. I'll have to find another hobby now with which to spend my time.
Thanks so much, Rocky. Yeah, we're all going to have to figure out what to do with our Saturday afternoons. We've got a number of questions, and just as always, go ahead and type those questions in your Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. One question that we've gotten from a couple people is, when did people start using forks?
Forks became common in 15th century Florence, believe it or not. In fact, we hear stories. They weren't the forks that we use with multiple prongs. They were usually two, like the one that he has in his hand. Where is it? Oh, there it is, sorry. If you look carefully, you see what it looks like? It's a long stem and then two prongs coming off of it. In 15th century Florence. And we hear stories, for instance, when French King Charles VIII invaded Italy and occupied Florence for all effective means, that his French soldiers were sitting down still eating with their hands, and the Florentines were all there using their utensils, and how intimidated the French felt at being superseded. In fact, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but one of the things that the Florentines always brag about is that French cuisine took this giant leap in quality when a woman named Catherine de' Medici married and became Queen of France. And so she took her whole kitchen staff with her to Paris. And it was there technically that French cuisine was born, but also the eating habits of the Florentines, which were much more civilized, using utensils like forks and then later knives as well.
And sort of a follow on from that, lots of discussion about what people are eating. So obviously with that Ravenna mosaic, we had sea bass, you mentioned lamb is common. What other things do we see depicted? Someone
recently sent me an article about rats And it's actually true. If you look at certain Last Suppers, I didn't believe it at first, but then he sent me as an attachment. I very briefly went over. But oftentimes you see these large rodents being served at Last Suppers as well. But most commonly, you will see sort of miniature lambs. There's a certain Last Supper, for the life of me, I can't remember who painted it, where it looks like there's a little miniature cow actually on the plate as well. It's interesting because there's a lot of research still to be done. A former graduate student from Syracuse University a few years back actually did her master's thesis on the food being served in a Last Supper, but I just can't remember which Last Supper. But it was amazing how each artist kind of applies his own. Leonardo was allegedly a vegetarian, from what we understand.
Right.
Not that I necessarily think he would ascribe vegetarianism to Jesus Christ, but I do think that the artists sort of bring their own cachet into choosing what the Jesus and the apostles are depicted eating.
Yeah, and locally as well. One of our attendees reminded me, and it's absolutely right, that in Peru you'll see Last Suppers with guinea pig because it's a delicacy in Peru, and it's true in the cathedral. I think in Cusco, the Last Supper there has guinea pig, which is sort of wild.
There you go.
We have a question about halos. So we talked a little bit about halos, and where, there are lots of theories about where halos come from, why they're used, when they sort of fall out of fashion. So can you talk just a little bit about how halos work, what they represent, when we see them being used and not used?
Yeah, I mean, so the halo, really, like most things in Christianity, are throwbacks to Judaism. So we've talked about, for instance, Moses by Michelangelo and the horns, and how those horns are essentially representations of the rays of light that were coming out of Moses' head after he was in the presence of Yahweh. So the idea that if Moses came into contact with the divine and then had this aura about him, so too did Christians have that. So in most early medieval representations, it's not a halo, it's a full body aura called a mandorla, which is the Italian word for almond, because they look like almond-shaped body halos. And then I think what happens is that it just gets a little tedious for artists. Imagine 13 of those full body halos behind me. It would just be this weird circle of light. So I think just for convenience sake, what happens, it sort of gets summed up to those two-dimensional metal plates that you see, for instance, in Duccio and Giotto. Then when perspective comes along in the early Renaissance, then the plate gets turned and foreshortened in perspective. And then it becomes an appendage. You follow? I mean, it just becomes this thing that artists are trying to figure out what to do. I mean, you still see artists using halos, but for someone who clung as tightly to the rules of nature as Leonardo did, I just think it would look, it's sort of like the Annunciation by Leonardo in the Uffizi in Florence, which doesn't have the dove representing the Holy Spirit. And I think he gets rid of the dove for the same reason he gets rid of the halos, because in the real world, we normally don't see fire-breathing doves dive-bombing virgins, and we also don't see metallic radiating discs hovering above people's heads. So, there are other ways, let's say, to render that sanctity other than the halos.
Yeah. One person wants to know, is there a specific, can we tell what the disciples and Christ are eating in Leonardo's Last Supper? Is it just bread and wine? Are we able to tell, or is that sort of an invention of restoration?
Actually, let's look at Veronese. Veronese looks like a Thanksgiving Day turkey or something in there. Look at that. Let me go back to Leonardo's. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think we can. There's a big empty plate right here. There's bread. And then there are dishes with food, one of which is completely deteriorated, and the other one instead looks like a darkish brownish meat. So again, I would imagine lamb, but I can't guarantee it.
Yeah. Let's see. We have a question about some of the models. Do we know anything about any of the faces in Leonardo's Last Supper? Are they supposed to represent real people? Do we know if he used particular models for anybody?
Supposedly, well, a lot of these faces you'll find in Leonardo's surviving drawings. He supposedly was someone who drew inspiration from nature. So he's not Caravaggio. He doesn't have 13 guys sitting at a table in front of him posing. What he does, in fact, I just did this the other day looking at Michelangelo's drawings. In fact, I think I mentioned this just before this whole craziness started. There was that fantastic show at the Getty Center in Los Angeles on Michelangelo's drawings. And what Michelangelo would do was to draw a figure, work the figure up, resolve how he's going to, and then you can actually spot that figure in a larger group drawing or drawing of figures. Leonardo did exactly the same thing. So you'll find arms, just arms on pages without bodies, faces, or anything else. You'll find faces on other pages. And then I think, at some point he probably did a cartoon, which no longer survives. And so the cartoon is the scale, full scale drawing technically of what he's going to do that then he applies to the wall and then sketches it out. So you're sort of scaling up from individual figures to probably a small scale cartoon like the one that I showed you, where Judas was sitting on the other side of the table. And then that finally gets scaled up to a full scale one where he figures it all out, technically speaking. And then oftentimes there are also variations that are made between the cartoon. Think of Raphael's famous School of Athens cartoon, where there are certain things that we see in the cartoon that we don't see in the final painting, and vice versa, things we see in the final painting that we don't see in the cartoon. So it morphs. It's never set in stone as to what's going on, but it starts at a very small scale and works its way up.
Got it. Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Rocky, I want you to know we have lots and lots and lots of people saying thank you and that they've enjoyed these lectures so much. And I think that they speak for all of us. We've had just a terrific time spending our summer with you. So thank you for
it was a real
today.
pleasure.
Yeah, and all of them. They've been just great. To everybody who's been with us, thank you so much for being part of this series with us. You can always, as you know, watch a replay of today's lecture or see any of the other lectures in this series that you may have missed or want to rewatch again at californiapatrons.org/lecture series. I would also really encourage you to check out the YouTube channel from the California Northwest Patrons. We have all the lectures from Rocky's series as well as Father Michael Collins' series up online, and there are tons of really interesting behind the scenes tours that you can see as well, and lots of inside information on the Vatican museums, the restoration labs, the gardens, and all kinds of really interesting stuff. So make sure you check it out. And last but certainly not least, we hope that those of you who are joining us as friends and guests will consider joining us as patrons. We would love to have you. This lecture series, like James says, is just one of the many things that we do on a regular basis. And as things start to, return to a little bit more normal, that of course includes tours of the Vatican museums in Rome, visits to local galleries and behind the scenes experiences, and fellowship with a lot of really fantastic people who all love art just as much as you do. So please consider it. We'd love to have you. Again, you can reach out to me or visit our website at californiapatrons.org anytime to learn more. And so on behalf of the California and Northwest chapters of the Patrons, thank you to all of you. Thank you to our sponsors and to Rocky and our other presenters, and just our best and warmest wishes to you and your families. So until we see you next time, take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.